The morning began like any other, quiet enough to hear the hum of distant traffic and the soft rustle of leaves brushing against one another. Yet beneath that calmness something trembled, a barely noticeable vibration in the air that made people pause without understanding why. The chosen ones, scattered throughout the city, each felt a strange heaviness pressing into their spirits. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like a warning knocking on the walls of their hearts, asking to be recognized. No one could articulate it, but all sensed the same thing. A shift had begun. Among them was Miriam, a young woman whose life had felt stagnant for months. Her prayers seemed to bounce back at her, unanswered, disconnected, as if someone else had intercepted the blessings meant for her. She tried to dismiss the feeling, but each passing day made it harder. Even her dreams had become strange, faces without eyes, hands reaching for things that didn't belong to them, and a repeated echo whispering, "What was taken will be returned." She didn't know what it meant, only that it had begun the same week the unusual heaviness settled over her. Far across town, Bishop Emmanuel sat in the quiet sanctuary of the old church, the early sunlight cutting through the stained glass windows and painting shifting colors across the room. He had been awake since before dawn, stirred by an unsettling vision. The night before, he had seen a figure standing at the edge of a courtroom, not in the natural realm, but in the spiritual one. The figure's hands were lifted defensively, but chains glowed around their wrists, bright as fire. A voice, neither loud nor soft, had spoken one sentence: "This person is about to get arrested for taking what does not belong to them." The vision faded, but the message burned in him still. The bishop did not immediately know who the figure represented or whose blessing had been taken, but he understood the spiritual weight of what he had seen. When heaven speaks of arrest, it is not the arrest of human hands. It is exposure, judgment, and the collapse of hidden schemes. Something stolen was about to be restored, and someone responsible was about to face consequences that could no longer be delayed. There are moments when God steps into a situation not because people demand justice, but because time itself demands it. Bishop Emmanuel sensed this was one of those moments. By midday, the strange whisper began circulating through the chosen one's community. No one knew exactly who started it, but the message passed from phone to phone, mouth to ear, like wind moving through branches. "This person is about to get arrested for taking your blessing." The phrasing varied slightly each time, but the message remained the same. People didn't understand it fully, but their spirits responded. Some felt sudden peace, as though a long-standing invisible battle was finally shifting in their favor. Others felt fear, sensing the uncovering of secrets they assumed would remain buried forever. Miriam heard it from her cousin. At first she laughed, thinking it was some dramatic rumor meant to stir excitement. But when she read the short text again, a shiver ran down her spine. The words echoed her dreams. Suddenly the whisper didn't feel like a rumor. It felt like confirmation. She sat still, listening to the thudding of her heartbeat. Something in her spirit came alive, like a lock clicking open. She didn't know who had taken what belonged to her, but she knew something had been wrong for a long time. Opportunities she was promised had slipped away without explanation. A promotion she had prayed for mysteriously went to someone far less qualified. Relationships drifted or failed without cause. Now, for the first time, it all made sense. Someone spiritually or physically had interfered with her destiny. As her thoughts raced, Bishop Emmanuel stepped up to the pulpit in the quiet sanctuary, even though no one was there to hear him. It was his habit, when the spiritual atmosphere shifted, to speak into the air, knowing that every word would settle where it needed to. He took a slow breath and began to pray with a steady, deliberate voice. The words weren't planned. They flowed like they had been waiting inside him. Wherever the hand of the thief has operated, let exposure meet them. Wherever destiny has been delayed, let restoration begin. Whoever has stretched their hand into what belongs to the chosen ones, whether knowingly or unknowingly. Let the hand of heaven arrest their actions now. The air in the sanctuary thickened, as if something invisible paused to listen. Bishop Emmanuel knew that spiritual theft was not always intentional, nor always carried out by humans. Sometimes envy opened the door, sometimes manipulation, sometimes spiritual interference from dark places. But whatever the source, the principle remained the same. What was taken unlawfully must be returned. As the bishop prayed, several of the chosen ones across the city felt a strengthening surge inside them. Miriam felt it most intensely. One moment she was sitting alone in her kitchen. The next she felt warmth spreading from her chest outward, a sensation she hadn't felt in months. Tears welled in her eyes without warning. It wasn't sadness, it was recognition. Something in the atmosphere had shifted in her favor. She whispered into the quiet room, "God, if this is you, show me." There was no thunder, no booming voice, but the peace that settled over her was answer enough. Meanwhile, the person responsible, the one who had taken what did not belong to them, felt the opposite. Their morning started normally, but by afternoon their heart was restless. Annoyance turned into agitation, agitation into uneasiness. They felt watched, exposed, though no one physically stood near them. It was the sensation a person gets when consequences begin to circle quietly, patiently. They tried to shake it off, but the discomfort followed them like a shadow. As the day turned to evening, Bishop Emmanuel understood why the whisper had begun circulating. The spiritual realm was preparing for an unveiling. Sometimes, before heaven acts, it allows a message to spread, not to frighten, but to prepare the hearts of those who waited long for justice. The chosen ones were being alerted that the season of delay had ended. Their blessings were not lost, only held, and those who held them were about to face the weight of divine correction. Night fell slowly over the city, the sky deepening into shades of blue and black. In homes, in workplaces, on streets, the chosen ones felt a quiet stirring, a readiness they couldn't explain. Something had been set in motion that could not be undone. In the stillness, each of them sensed the same truth rising like a tide. What had been taken was already on its way back. And somewhere, unseen but certain, the spiritual arrest had already begun. The days that followed the mysterious warning were heavy with curiosity and suspicion. People moved differently, watching one another with cautious eyes, wondering who among them might be the one responsible for tampering with destinies. The whisper, "This person is about to get arrested for taking your blessing," still traveled through conversations like a quiet rumor, but by now it carried weight. It wasn't gossip anymore, it had become something people felt in their bones. The chosen ones sensed that the truth was drawing closer, and with it a painful realization. Sometimes the enemy operates behind the smile of someone trusted. Miriam especially found herself replaying the events of the past year, searching for signs she had once ignored. She was the kind of person who believed in second chances, always giving the benefit of the doubt, always forgiving quicker than she healed. But now her mind was clearer. Faces began coming to mind, people who had entered her life at the exact time her blessings went missing, people whose presence felt warm on the surface but cold underneath. A colleague at work who always asked intrusive questions about her opportunities. A childhood friend who celebrated her failures more than her successes. Even a close relative who constantly discouraged her, warning her that not everyone is meant to rise. She had brushed these moments aside, thinking they were just small human flaws. Now she wondered if they were something more intentional. One memory in particular rose to the front. Months earlier she had confided in someone she trusted deeply, a friend named Liane. Miriam had excitedly shared that she was being considered for a position she had prayed for, one that would finally bring stability into her life. Liane had smiled, congratulated her, and even hugged her. But behind the hug, Miriam now remembered a stiffness, a pause, a shift in energy. Days later, the opportunity inexplicably collapsed. And strangely, Leanne seemed too relieved, too comfortable with the outcome. At the time, Miriam forced herself not to think too much of it, but now, as the pieces rearranged themselves, she realized that sometimes the thief isn't a stranger, it is the person you least expect. Across the city, Bishop Emmanuel spent long hours in prayer. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw fragments of the same vision, chains burning with bright light, a figure shrinking under the weight of truth, and shadows pulling away from hidden corners. The bishop understood that before exposure occurs, shadows must be removed. What is done in darkness thrives only as long as the darkness remains unchallenged. But now the spiritual atmosphere was glowing with a light that refused to dim. He felt deep compassion even for the one who would be exposed. It is never easy to face the consequences of envy or manipulation. But divine justice is not about vengeance, it is about restoration. Bishop Emmanuel often taught that blessings are not objects, they are assignments, pieces of a person's destiny mapped out carefully and intentionally. When someone interferes with another's blessing, they are not just taking something, they are disrupting the divine timeline of someone else's life. The consequences of such acts echo far beyond what the eye can see. The bishop sensed that the time for revelation was approaching. But revelation never arrives alone. It brings discomfort, truth, and confrontation. Before the thief is exposed, the victim must first recognize the shadow behind the smile. On an overcast afternoon, Miriam decided to visit the small cafe she used to frequent. She wanted to clear her mind, to sit in a place that once brought her comfort. The rain outside formed a soft curtain against the windows, and the scent of coffee drifted warm through the air. She chose a corner seat and allowed herself to breathe. But peace was short-lived. Moments later, she saw Leanne walk in, umbrella dripping, eyes scanning the room. Their eyes met, and Miriam felt her stomach knot, not with fear, but with the certainty that she was seeing something clearly for the first time. Leanne approached with a forced brightness in her voice, as though she were trying too hard to sound normal. "Miriam, I haven't seen you in so long," she said, sliding into the seat across from her without waiting to be invited. Miriam nodded, her expression unreadable. "It's been a while." Nothing in the cafe moved except the hum of the coffee machine and the soft murmur of voices. Outside, the rain deepened. Inside, the tension thickened. Leanne spoke quickly, too quickly. She asked questions that sounded friendly but felt probing. "So what's new? Any opportunities? Anything happening?" Every question felt like a hand reaching where it shouldn't. Miriam suddenly understood that this was not a coincidence. The atmosphere around Leanne had always been slightly off, but now it felt like it was screaming at her. It was as though the spiritual veil thinned enough for her to see the truth. Miriam realized that the whisper circulating through the community was not just about exposure, it was about empowerment. Until a person recognizes the thief, true restoration cannot begin. Miriam didn't confront her, she didn't need to. Truth does not always need words. Sometimes awareness alone is enough to break chains. Instead, she simply observed, listened, and allowed the silence to speak for her. Leanne grew unsettled, shifting in her seat, her eyes darting away. It was as though she felt the spiritual pressure pressing in on her. People who operate in shadows often feel the weight of light before anything is said. Eventually, Leanne left, her goodbye rushed and awkward. Miriam watched her go, feeling strangely lighter. For the first time, she understood what Bishop Emmanuel meant when he taught that discernment is not suspicion. It is clarity given by God to those whose destinies have been interfered with. Across the city, others experienced similar revelations. A man discovered that his business partner had been secretly sabotaging deals. A young mother realized a relative had been praying against her progress. A student recognized a friend's jealousy disguised as concern. One by one, truth surfaced. One by one, shadows shifted. The chosen ones began to see clearly who had stood in the way of their blessing. Meanwhile, the one responsible, The main figure in the spiritual vision felt pressure tightening around them. Their smiles felt forced. Their confidence crumbled. They avoided eye contact, avoided conversations, avoided their own reflection. People who interfere with destiny's sense when their time is almost up. It is an internal shaking, a trembling that cannot be suppressed. The closer the exposure came, the heavier their guilt became. In the quiet hours of the night, Bishop Emmanuel felt a deep stirring in his spirit. He knew the unraveling had begun. What was hidden was crawling toward the surface. The thief was standing on the edge of spiritual arrest, and the chosen ones were waking up to the truth of who had been blocking their blessings. But exposure was only the first step. Revelation must be followed by justice, and justice must be followed by restoration. The days continued with an intensity Miriam had never experienced before. As though the spiritual world had pulled her into an investigation she never agreed to join. Yet she couldn't pull away. There was a tug, a pull, a divine insistence that she see what she had refused to see for far too long. It wasn't paranoia, it wasn't fear, it was clarity, and clarity is its own kind of power. Across the city, the chosen ones were experiencing the same awakening. People who had spent months or years feeling blocked suddenly felt the weight of truth settling in their spirits. Blessings delayed, opportunities lost, doors that should have opened but didn't. None of it had been random. Something or someone had interfered, and now the investigation had begun, not in courtrooms built by human hands, but in the inner courts of the Spirit. Miriam found herself thinking more deeply than she ever had about the invisible side of life. She always believed in God, believed in destiny, believed in purpose, but she hadn't believed how much influence unseen forces had on the physical world. Now she understood. Every missed promotion, every failed relationship, every friendship that dissolved without explanation. None of it had been coincidence. They were pieces of a larger puzzle she had never bothered to assemble, but she was assembling it now. She started with her dreams. Every night they grew more vivid, almost cinematic. She saw paths she should have taken, doors that had been meant to open, moments when blessings approached her, but were snatched away by a dark hand that disappeared before she could see its owner. In one dream, she saw herself standing before a large treasure chest glowing with light. Just as she reached for it, a shadowy figure rushed in, slammed the chest shut, and dragged it away into darkness. When she woke, she felt the frustration of someone who had lost something real, not imaginary. On the other side of the city, Bishop Emmanuel spent the evening walking the length of the sanctuary in silence. His steps echoed through the empty building, the sound reverberating through the vaulted ceiling as though the walls themselves were listening. That was the thing about spiritual matters. Sometimes the earth itself seems to lean in. He paused at the pulpit, closed his eyes, and breathed deeply. He whispered, "Show them what they need to see." It wasn't a command. It wasn't even a prayer in the traditional sense. It was a request born from compassion. The chosen ones could not fight an enemy they couldn't identify, nor could they reclaim blessings they didn't fully realize had been stolen. They needed revelation. They needed discernment sharper than instinct and deeper than intuition. As the words left his lips, a vision flashed before him. He saw several people standing in the middle of a large circle drawn in glowing light. Outside the circle, shadows paced restlessly, unable to cross the boundary. Inside the circle, each person held a key, golden, gleaming, but faint. The keys represented the revelation they needed to unlock what was taken from them. The vision faded as quickly as it came, but the message remained. Every chosen one was about to be handed the insight they needed. Meanwhile, Miriam began noticing things she had never paid attention to. She overheard conversations that had nothing to do with her yet somehow held answers. She noticed sudden tension in certain people when she entered a room. She observed glances, quick, nervous, almost fearful. It was as though her awareness had become a spotlight, shining on places where darkness used to hide comfortably. One afternoon she walked into her workplace break room and found two colleagues whispering. The moment they saw her, they exchanged a look and fell silent. Miriam didn't say a word, but inside she felt something shift. The spiritual investigation wasn't just personal, it extended into her environment. Every unspoken plot, every concealed motive, every act of envy disguised as concern was unraveling one thread at a time. The person responsible for disrupting her blessing, the one connected to the spiritual arrest Bishop Emmanuel saw, felt that unraveling more than anyone else. They moved through their days like someone avoiding invisible traps. Their sleep was shallow. Their thoughts were loud. They felt exposed. They felt watched. They felt as though the world had turned a mirror toward them, revealing the parts of themselves they tried to cover in charm and excuses. People who interfere with destiny rarely consider the consequences. They don't think about spiritual law. They don't think about divine timing. They operate in secrecy, believing darkness will always shield them. But when heaven begins an investigation, there is no hiding place. Not in the mind, not in the heart, not even in the shadows. The bishop felt the shift. He knew the investigation process had moved into its second phase, a confrontation. Not physical confrontation, but spiritual. The kind of confrontation where truth rises, whether people are ready for it or not. That night he felt compelled to call a prayer meeting. Only a handful of people showed up, but numbers didn't matter. What mattered was alignment. The moment they gathered, the atmosphere thickened, not with heaviness, but with purpose. The bishop opened his Bible, but didn't read from it. Instead, he spoke what he felt in his spirit. You have believed your delays were coincidences. You believed your setbacks were bad luck. But heaven says no. Heaven says your blessings were interfered with. And now, every hand that touched what was yours is being exposed. The people in the room felt the words settle over them like weighty cloth. Some gasped quietly, others bowed their heads. Revelation, when it comes, can shake a person to their core. After the meeting, Miriam walked home under a sky filled with low-hanging clouds. The street lights flickered occasionally, casting long shadows on the pavement. The world felt both familiar and different, as though she were seeing it through new eyes. And she was. She had been awakened into spiritual sensitivity, and once awakened, a person cannot go back to blindness. Halfway home, she stopped walking. Her breath caught. Something invisible passed over her, an overwhelming knowing. It wasn't fear, it wasn't dread, it was recognition. A name rose in her mind, uninvited but undeniable. She whispered it, stunned at how clearly it came. The name of the one who had interfered, the one whose hands had reached for what wasn't theirs, the one tied to her stolen blessing. She stood still for several moments, letting the truth settle. She didn't cry, she didn't shake, she simply understood. The purpose of the investigation was not to punish the thief, it was to free her, to return what was taken, to restore what had been delayed. And now she knew exactly who had played a role in her suffering. The spiritual investigation had reached a turning point. The thief had been identified. And now, heaven would decide what happened next. The night after Miriam received the revelation of the name, sleep would not come easily. It wasn't fear that kept her awake. It was the intensity of what she now understood. She lay beneath the faint glow of her bedside lamp, staring at the ceiling as if the pieces of her life were reassembling themselves above her. The truth had come with clarity, not confusion. It felt as though someone had lifted a veil she never realized was there, and everything she had tolerated, excused, or ignored now stood before her in undeniable light. Across the city, the spiritual realm stirred with equal intensity. What had been hidden was no longer hidden. What had been obscured was now exposed. When a thief is identified in the spirit, the next stage is unavoidable judgment. Not human judgment fueled by anger or revenge, but divine judgment, measured, righteous, and precise. The sense of exposure reached even the one responsible. They woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, their heart pounding. Their dreams were filled with flashing lights, echoing footsteps, and a voice announcing charges they could not understand. They felt hunted by something they could not see. Guilt is its own prison, but spiritual guilt is an arrest before the arrest. Their world, once secure in secrecy, was crumbling. Meanwhile, Bishop Emmanuel had spent the night in quiet meditation rather than sleep. The atmosphere was shifting too strongly for him to rest. He sensed the spiritual arrest happening the way one senses a storm before it breaks, not by sight, but by pressure. The air felt charged, silence felt loud, every breath carried a reverence that only appears when heaven is moving decisively. Just before dawn, the bishop rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the front of the sanctuary. The stained glass windows were still dark, waiting for the sun to rise. But even in the dimness, he felt a presence, a stillness that was not empty, but filled with the weight of divine activity. He placed his hands on the pulpit and closed his eyes. In that moment, he saw again the vision of the figure in chains. But this time the vision was clearer, sharper. The figure stood frozen, their hands bound by glowing restraints, their head bowed as though the truth had finally caught up with them. Around them were watchers, not people, but spiritual witnesses, silent, solemn, and unmoving. The ground beneath the figure pulsed with light, as though recording every act, every intention, every word spoken in darkness. The bishop felt the heaviness of justice hovering, ready to fall. He whispered, "It has begun." And it had. While the bishop prayed, Miriam felt something shift in her own atmosphere. She rose from her bed, compelled by a quiet voice inside her urging her to prepare herself. She didn't know what for, but she knew it was something significant. She sat at the edge of her bed and breathed deeply. Her heart did not race. Her hands did not shake. Instead, she felt a calm strength filling her, as though a burden she had carried unknowingly for years was finally being lifted. What happens spiritually often reveals itself physically. And on this day, as the sun rose over the city, that revelation began. Miriam went about her morning routine, but everything felt heightened. Colors looked sharper, sounds felt louder, even the air tasted different somehow. She sensed that the unraveling of her stolen blessing was reaching its climax. She could feel justice approaching, not in anger, but in order. Heaven brings order where there has been disorder. Heaven brings truth where there has been deception. At work that day, the atmosphere was off. People whispered more than usual, glancing around nervously. An uncomfortable tension filled the hallways, like a storm gathering behind closed doors. When Miriam walked in, conversations halted abruptly. She felt eyes on her, not with hostility, but with uncertainty. Something had shifted, and everyone sensed it, even if they didn't understand it. The one responsible for her stolen blessing avoided her entirely, taking sudden detours to other rooms, pretending to be busy, pretending not to notice her presence. But avoidance cannot hide guilt. Every step they took seemed weighed down by something heavy and unseen. They felt as though every corner of the building carried eyes that watched them. Every silence carried accusation. Their heart thudded with an anxiety they could not explain, not to themselves, not to others. Throughout the day, Miriam felt movement around her, not physically but spiritually. She felt a warmth in her chest that grew stronger as the hours passed. It felt like her blessing was drawing nearer, like it had begun its return journey back to her. Blessings that are stolen or delayed vibrate spiritually when release is near. They recognize their rightful owner. They find their way home. Meanwhile, Bishop Emmanuel prepared for what he sensed would be a significant evening gathering. He did not know who would come or what would unfold, but he felt the pull of destiny. When divine justice approaches, it leaves ripples in the physical realm. Unexpected events, sudden confessions, unplanned encounters. As evening fell, the clouds gathered densely across the sky. Thunder murmured somewhere in the distance. It wasn't a violent storm, just a warning in the air. The bishop stood at the front of the sanctuary, as a small group filtered in, many of them drawn not by invitation, but by an unexplained inner prompting. Miriam walked in last, her steps slow, steady, purposeful. The bishop did not preach a sermon. He didn't need to. Instead, he spoke gently, as though addressing the air around them. "Tonight," he said, "Haven settles accounts." The room trembled with a silence so thick it felt almost tangible. People bowed their heads instinctively, not in fear, but in reverence. In that silence, something broke. An invisible cord snapped in the spiritual realm. Miriam felt it deep in her chest, like a sudden unburdening. She gasped softly as tears gathered in her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. Something stolen had been released. At the exact same moment across the city, the one responsible felt a sharp pressure, like a door slamming shut behind them. They fell into a chair, breathing heavily, overwhelmed by an intense sense of exposure. Their secrets, their intentions, their manipulations, all the things they thought no one could ever know, suddenly felt like they were written across their forehead for the world to read. They felt cornered by truth itself. Some spiritual arrests are not loud. Some happen quietly, inside the conscience, inside the heart, inside the soul, where denial cannot survive. Back in the sanctuary, Bishop Emmanuel lifted his eyes and spoke softly. "What was taken will be restored. What was delayed will be released. The one who interfered can no longer continue. Judgment has been rendered." The air shifted. Miriam felt warmth spread through her body like light returning to a cold place. She knew, without being told, that something final had occurred. Some sentence had been passed in the spiritual realm. She didn't need to witness the arrest. She didn't need to see the consequences unfold. She just knew it had happened. The spiritual arrest had been executed. The path to restoration was now opened. The morning after the spiritual arrest, something felt different. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was subtle, like the quiet after a storm when the air feels lighter and the world seems washed clean. Miriam opened her eyes slowly, half expecting the heaviness of the past months to greet her the way it always did, but this time it wasn't there. Something had lifted from her life, something she hadn't fully realized she had been carrying every single day. She sat up, placed her feet on the floor, and took a long breath. The air felt softer, almost warm. For a moment she simply sat in the stillness, listening to the faint morning sounds outside, birds in distant trees, a car engine humming somewhere down the street. It was all ordinary, yet somehow different. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace not dependent on circumstances but rising from deep within. The spiritual arrest had broken something. Now the return had begun. Restoration rarely announces itself with fanfare. It begins quietly, like the sunrise, one ray at a time. For Miriam, the first ray of restoration came through a simple email. She opened her laptop to check something unrelated, but there it was. An unexpected message from a company she had applied to months ago. They apologized for delays. They said the position was available again. They wanted to talk to her immediately. Her heart raced as she stared at the screen. This was the opportunity she had believed for, the one that had slipped away without explanation. Now it was returning to her as naturally as though it had never been interrupted. She placed her hand over her mouth, overwhelmed. This was not coincidence. This was not timing. This was restoration. Across the city, the chosen ones were experiencing similar shifts. A man received approval for a loan he had been denied repeatedly for reasons that never made sense. A mother who had been battling constant obstacles suddenly found doors opening effortlessly. A student who kept losing opportunities found himself favored in places he had been overlooked. All of them felt the same strange truth. Something that had been blocked had been released. Restoration is not just the return of what was lost. It is the return of what was meant to be, untouched this time by interference. Meanwhile, the one responsible for the spiritual theft was dealing with consequences they could not voice to anyone. Everything in their life felt unstable. Plans they had made fell apart. Conversations turned against them. People they once influenced grew distant. The spiritual arrest had not harmed them physically, but internally they were unraveling. When someone interferes with another person's destiny, the consequences often mirror the harm they caused. Disruption returns to the one who disrupted. Confusion returns to the one who sowed confusion. It is not revenge, it is a spiritual principle. Miriam did not think about them. She didn't feel hatred or bitterness. She felt nothing. Their significance in her story had evaporated. They were no longer part of her journey, no longer carrying pieces of her destiny. What was hers was coming back to her, and their chapter in her life had closed. Later that afternoon she met with Bishop Emmanuel at the sanctuary, unable to shake the desire to share what had happened. When she stepped inside, the room felt different, lighter, warmer, alive. It wasn't the lighting, it wasn't the temperature, it was the atmosphere. The same place where judgment had been executed last night was now filled with something else entirely renewal. The bishop greeted her with a knowing look. He didn't need her to explain. He could see it on her face, in her posture, even in the way she walked. Restoration had begun. She told him about the email, about the sudden peace she felt, and he listened quietly with a soft smile. When she finished, he nodded gently. Restoration, he said, always begins the moment interference ends. Once the thief's hand is removed, destiny can flow without resistance. His words resonated in her, settling like truth she had always known but had forgotten. The bishop continued, and what returns is never the same as before. It comes back blessed, multiplied, strengthened. Because heaven never restores to the original level, it restores beyond. She felt that deeply. She knew this was not simply a returned opportunity, it was a redeemed one. Over the next few days the blessings continued arriving, each one a thread of her destiny weaving itself back into place. She received calls from people she had long forgotten, offering unexpected support. Opportunities that had once slipped through her fingers now seemed to run toward her. Peace settled into her home like a gentle companion. Even her dreams changed. Instead of the shadowy figure stealing her blessings, she now saw light paths opening before her, each one glowing with possibilities she had never considered. But restoration was not just external. Something inside her healed. Her self-confidence, once eroded by silent disappointments, now returned stronger. Her ability to trust in God's timing deepened. Her discernment sharpened. She was no longer the woman who doubted herself when things went wrong. She was becoming someone new, someone whole. Across the city, many chosen ones awakened to the same inner healing. For some, relationships were repaired. For others, finances stabilized. Broken spirits were mended. Lost energy returned. Even environments shifted. Homes felt lighter. Workplaces felt different. People who once felt invisible suddenly felt seen. It was as though heaven had breathed restoration into the very fabric of their lives. Meanwhile, Bishop Emmanuel continued praying quietly for each person experiencing the return of their blessing. He understood that restoration is delicate. It requires gratitude, awareness, and wisdom. A blessing returned must be held differently than before. It must be honored, protected, and stewarded. He also knew something else, that the period of restoration was only the beginning. Blessings returning were only the first wave. The second wave would be elevation. When something is restored in the spiritual realm, it often comes with acceleration. What once took years suddenly takes days. What once required struggle becomes effortless. He sensed this acceleration approaching, a divine momentum that would carry the chosen ones into territory they had never imagined, and Miriam felt it too. One evening, she stood on her balcony, looking at the city below as the sun set in streaks of orange and gold. The cool breeze brushed against her skin, filling her with a sense of completion and anticipation at once. She whispered softly into the fading light, "Thank you." She wasn't thanking the universe or destiny. She was thanking the one who had seen her suffering when she didn't speak of it, who had watched her endurance when no one noticed, who had stepped in at the exact moment justice was needed. She felt seen, protected, restored. The night sky deepened into a soft blue, and she stood there knowing one thing for certain: her blessing had come back home. But something else was waiting on the horizon, something even greater, something that was now possible only because restoration had taken place. The rise of the restored ones did not happen in a moment, nor did it come with trumpet blasts or the kind of dramatic signs people usually expect when destiny shifts. It unfolded quietly at first, like dawn breaking after a long night, soft, steady, unstoppable. The chosen ones found themselves waking with a strange peace they could not explain, a confidence that wrapped around them like a garment they had never worn before. It wasn't arrogance, it was awareness. They could feel in their bones that something which had been locked away, delayed, or hidden was now being handed back to them by unseen hands. And though they could not see the full picture, they felt the nearness of breakthrough as tangibly as breath on glass. It was Bishop Emmanuel who sensed it first. For weeks, he had been praying with an intensity that surprised even him, warring in the spirit for those whose blessings had been tampered with. Now, one morning as he stood alone in the quiet of the sanctuary, he felt the pressure lift. A warmth surged through him, heavy and sweet, as if heaven had exhaled. He whispered a thank you without fully knowing why. But in the days that followed, the signs became clearer. People began approaching him with testimonies that sounded like echoes of each other. Long lost opportunities returning, favor being restored, closed doors reopening, forgotten dreams stirring again. Some came with shaking hands, others with tears streaming freely. All of them carried the same bewildered expression. How could this be happening now, after so long? The answer, Bishop Emmanuel knew, was simple but profound. What was theirs had been returned. Not because they fought with human strength, but because God had issued an arrest warrant in the spirit for the one who interfered with their destiny. Once judgment was passed, restoration followed like a river freed from a dam. The chosen ones moved through their days with a renewed sense of purpose. They found themselves saying things they never dared to say before, stepping into places they once feared to approach, and walking with a boldness that came not from pride, but from clarity. They were no longer confused about who they were. They were no longer apologizing for existing. They were no longer shrinking to make others comfortable. Some felt blessings returning in the form of opportunities. Calls from employers who previously rejected them, project doors reopening, people reaching out with long delayed approvals. For others, restoration came emotionally. A heaviness that had lived in their chest for years was suddenly gone, replaced by a peace they feared they would never feel again. Some woke up with newfound ideas, inspirations, and visions that had been buried under discouragement. It was as if their minds had been unlocked from a cage they never realized they were trapped in. Yet not everything was obvious. For some of the chosen ones, the restoration came slowly. At first, they questioned whether anything had shifted at all, but even they began to notice small signs. A conversation that went better than expected, a path opening where there had only been walls, a sudden sense of direction where confusion once ruled. They learned that restoration does not always arrive in a flood. Sometimes it comes like dew, softly settling until everything is refreshed. One particular evening, Bishop Emmanuel gathered them all for a service unlike any before. The sanctuary was filled with an atmosphere thick enough to touch. No one needed to be told to quiet their hearts. The silence fell naturally, reverently. The bishop looked around at the faces before him, faces that had once carried fear, uncertainty, frustration, even despair. Now he saw light where shadows used to hide. He saw strength where weakness used to live. He saw the rise of people who had learned the hard way that destiny can be delayed but never destroyed. He began to speak, not with theatrics, but with the gravity of someone delivering a message straight from God's own breath. He told them that restoration was not the end, but the beginning. that the reason their blessings had returned was not only because the enemy had been exposed, but because they had matured enough to carry what they were originally meant to receive. He reminded them that their suffering had not been wasted. Every tear had watered the ground they were now called to walk upon. Every disappointment had carved out space for resilience. Every loss had sharpened their vision. They were stronger now, not because life had been easy, but because it had not. He spoke of identity, how the greatest theft the enemy often attempts is not possessions or opportunities, but the very sense of who a person is. Many nodded because they knew this truth intimately. There were days when they doubted their worth, questioned their calling, or felt unqualified for the very promises spoken over them. But now something had shifted. They no longer viewed themselves through the lens of past wounds. They stood differently. They prayed differently. They expected differently. Some felt emotion rising in their throats as he spoke, because they realized that all along God had been preparing them for this moment. The rise of restored ones. They were not the same people who entered the valley. They had been pressed, but not broken. They had been delayed, but not denied. And now they carried an authority that only comes from surviving battles unseen. When the bishop finished speaking, there was no dramatic shouting, no wild celebration. Instead, a deep, settled stillness filled the room. It was the quiet confidence of people who finally understood that no one could permanently take what God had permanently assigned to them. They were restored not just in blessing, but in identity. They were aligned with destiny in a way that could never again be easily shaken. In the days that followed, the chosen ones began moving through their lives with renewed purpose. They stopped entertaining voices that belittled their calling. They stopped apologizing for favor. They stopped hiding their gifts to make others feel comfortable. They rose, not with noise, but with certainty. And everywhere they went, doors opened that had long refused to budge. Not because they begged, but because they finally walked in the confidence of those who know that what is theirs cannot be stolen again. And so the story closed not with revenge, but with restoration, not with fear, but with faith, not with loss, but with the rise of those who had been refined by fire and returned to purpose. Their testimony became simple. Everything that was taken has been restored, and everything restored has prepared us to rise.